everybody, and welcome to Publish Me, Punish Me, a comedy series examining deal practices within the games industry. With me, Evva Karr, founder and CEO at Glitch.
And I'm Sun studio director of Perfect Garbage. Each episode, we dive into indie game publishers, crowdfunding, equity deals, and a whole lot more.
So whether it's the good, the bad, or just plain yikes, we're going to talk about all of it. If you're interested in discussions about the design and business of video games, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel below. And today we have so many deals.
Yeah.
The leaked ones.
I was gonna say none of them were allowed.
This is the forbidden episode.
The forbidden fruit.
Forbidden deals.
That really only came up because of the Epple.
Epple. Honestly, can we call it that?
The Epple.
The Epple fight.
Which is the Epic versus Apple stuff.
That Epic versus Apple fight has really introduced a lot of biz dev to the forefront in games. It's a hot topic, which is very exciting because you know how we always talk about how secret it is all the time.
Yeah, I love the fact that it just like, I appreciate that it's out there, and I appreciate that it almost kind of just leaked in a way because of the fact that it doesn't ever put anyone at risk. Like the devs didn't, post it out there.
It was like almost it sounds to say weird, but an unbiased leak.
Yes.
Like it wasn't telling a narrative directly from the horse's
yeah
mouth.
How did you feel when you first saw it?
I took notes.
What were those notes? Were you just frantically writing them all down?
Yeah. I was like, how much is a game really worth? Like,
how much should I be asking Epic for?
Well, I think it's really interesting because something about the leaks is that we had leaks that were of licensing and leaks that were of development. Or sometimes people would group both. Maybe that licensing deal is what you use for development. It was interesting because licensing deals are such a big, licensing deals are such a big deal, but it's like you selling your game for a platform for an unspecified amount of time, depending on who, for how long, where it's basically super accessible to that platform, whether it's going to be on a subscription service, whether it's going to be exclusive. And so seeing those numbers is very juicy.
So you're saying licensing, and I think licensing for you is what I typically will call buyouts, right?
Yes.
So when you say licensing, you mean a platform, whether it's like Epic or Apple or anyone, right? Like Game Pass. I mean, like honestly, any of them. Really what it comes down to is like one of these platforms will say like, hey, we would like your game on our platform at this time. In the scenario of Game Pass, it'll be like, okay, well, we want it day one on Game Pass when you announce it, and they want it for maybe like 1 year or 2 years or however long, and then they will pay you a lump sum to do that. And oftentimes that lump sum is either in advance before the game comes out, or it comes maybe like 6 months or a year after a game has already been out. It definitely varies. And I think it really depends on like which game you are, where you're at in your cycle, how many people are going to come into their platform based off of your community. It's just a lot of different things. But I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. And if you're talking about licensing in that way, I really am thinking about it in terms of the word buyouts, because
I see licensing usually in the contract. And so I'm used to thinking of licensing. And also the reason I resort to licensing is they have a lot of marketing controls. They could slap you on the cover of promotional material. Like that is actually signed in those contracts that they can kind of put your game in, or the art of your game on certain elements of the store or certain elements of bundles and things like that. And so I always think of licensing because they're using your image as well. A lot of the time they have usually the right to display your game at conventions too, if you want to negotiate that.
For our viewers, if you're saying licensing, I'm saying buyouts, and hopefully that's okay.
We mean the same thing.
Yes, we mean the same thing
in the context of this video for this moment. But how did you feel? Because I know how I felt. Greedy and upset. like a little
greedy
gremlin.
and obsessed.
I was like, I want this for me as I looked at it. But how did you feel?
I had a lot of mixed feelings. I was like, yay, it's out and it's leaked. I love this. And then I was like, oh, damn, some people should have asked for way more money. So it was kind of like this moment of like, this is really cool. I'm really thankful. And oftentimes, I think a lot of like with EGS specifically, they have, their 1 week buyouts. I started
these are
asking
free, right? When
Yeah.
you get to play them on the Epic Store, they're free to play.
Yes. So basically, it's what has Epic Game Store actually bought out for 1 week. Typically, it might be longer, it might be shorter, but usually it's 1 week for their free game. So you'll oftentimes see like, okay, this week it's this game, next week it's this game. This is their free game, and they just give it out to everyone. Whoever wants to claim a copy gets a copy. And so I was like, this is cool that it's up and it's available for a lot of people to see. I am really thankful that it's now public knowledge and it's leaked. Looking at the numbers for downloads, I was like, damn, I want to get into that, and I want to talk a lot about that during this conversation about what those numbers mean and assessing what those deals actually are. So maybe we can.
As soon as you mentioned it, I knew that, because my focus immediately went with how much were they bought out. But something that you had pointed out to me, which I'm sure we'll dive into more, is the convergence rate of like joining Epic Game Store and like having an account due to that game being available for that week. Which I think paints a really thing about that is that it's really hard to use that as a basis for money until it's happened. I.e. Steam wish list.
Do you want to just jump right into looking at this document? Because I want to talk all about it.
I just want to point out, if someone hasn't seen this document and not until this moment, there is a lot of quote unquote heavy hitters like on this list in the AAA to indie sphere. They're put together. And what I mean by heavy hitters in indie is I'm going to bring up Supergiant, which is like, I think a hot topic, like Supergiant's on this list. So it's got a very interesting array of like games that they've purchased to have free for that week.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also a mixture between developers and publishers too, which I think is really wonderful. And that goes to what you're saying, Sun, where it's like there's a large range from like big AAA companies to also smaller indie studios that make up maybe like less than 20 people. So that's a really beautiful thing. And I love that it's out here in the public that so many people can see just in a straight up spreadsheet. So if we're looking at this EGS document, let's just go from left to right. We see the titles on the left-hand side, the seller, which is oftentimes either the independent studio or also the publisher, right? The date as well. And then, wow, you were right, Alana. This is really small. I'm not going to be able to see this.
Yeah, I told you. Go put your glasses on.
What does entitlements mean?
That's just like how many people claimed the free game. And then buyout price is how much Epic paid to have the game on their platform.
The next column is new Epic accounts. So that just means new people that actually downloaded Epic in order to be able to claim that game. And then the Epic UA cost, which honestly just means the amount that Epic had paid per new user.
So their goal is to make that number small.
Yes. And then the percentage that's new to Epic. Let's just go ahead and start talking about the juiciest parts here.
So my rule of thumb, whether it's positive or negative, is you can judge a situation by the worst deal that's happened, because the publisher or the platform or whatever system is going to be working with you and from a dev side is going to be affected by that worst deal more than all the success deals. And so I like immediately went to like, I don't want to say worst deal because that's not the correct, but any deal that had a high UA cost.
That developer is essentially getting I would say a good deal if their UA cost is high.
So the developer would want the UA cost high, but Epic would want the UA cost low.
So anyone who is on this list, say...
I went to Celeste.
Yeah. $11.12 for Inside.
Yeah,
and
I love that for them. I loved it.
Yeah, Matt Makes Games at $12. Like holy, like that's really, really good, and I'm really happy for them because those are both also like indie titles, right?
They're also older games, you know. Some of the, like I said, we talked about Transistor earlier and things like that, but a lot of these games are newer when they were releasing. But both Inside and Celeste in 2019 had already been released for a bit.
For a few years.
It's a good deal in the sense that they've kind of gotten a lot of their first and second wave traction out before making it.
Something about EGS that I've actually really enjoyed is the fact that most of the time these buyouts come after initial release, unlike say like a Game Pass deal where it comes out, you know, first day on Game Pass, right?
No.
So it's actually an additional boost later on to the developers to actually be able to get these types of deals, which I think is really, really cool, and helps with kind of like that long tail of funding that comes in for that game.
So yeah, that's where my mind jumped. And then of course, I mean, like the easy answer is who did they pay for the most? Which you immediately go to look for. And just from my cursory glance, it seems like that is Batman Arkham from Warner Bros.
Yeah, you're talking about the overall buyout price, but not the Epic UA cost.
No, yeah, I jumped.
It seems like the average lower end is $50,000 and the high end was 1.5.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what I would consider their budget. Yeah. How do you feel about some of the UA costs to the actual buyout prices on some of these, Sun?
I think, like you said, some people definitely got a rough deal. It's always so easy to talk about this in retrospect, oh, damn, they should have put a higher agreeing price on the license or buyout. They should have asked for more, but you just don't know these stats beforehand. And if you're kind of like new to this format, which I think Epic is doing something kind of, I mean, now we can talk about how a lot of publishers might be following suit, but this is like 2018, 2019, where it's just like getting bigger. Like I can imagine, I don't want to say underselling, but not knowing what to expect from this sort of situation. Anything that isn't in the 6-figure range, I'm kind of like, ooh, why? It's like I actually went to the really smaller buyout costs, and I haven't played all of these games, so I don't know what's up. But it's interesting to note, like Fez, for example, was only 75,000.
Yeah, it is hella old, which I think actually brings us to a good part about talking about like, how do you actually calculate what, I feel like we're going to keep asking this question over and over and over again. And we should even rename the show. Is like, how do you calculate how much your game is worth? Like
calculate your worth.
Yes. How do you calculate your worth? Which is a really loaded question, but that's something that I think is really important for us to even touch base on, because I think a couple of things come up in my mind. For example, how long has your game been out? How honest to God, like how many copies actually sold? And when I say copies sold, it's more like visible copies sold. So like how many people actually downloaded it? How many people are like in your overall community that have downloaded and or played the game? It doesn't necessarily mean sold in my mind, right? So for example, if you did do like a Game Pass, or if you did do one of these buyout deals from somewhere else, you at least have a general idea of how many people were interested in your game. So that to me means something. And that could be, again, like social numbers or Discord numbers or review numbers even that are on Steam, or the number of downloads that you've had on, say, like another service platform.
I think community building is important, things like that. I know we've already discussed like time frame. How long is it since you've been released? A part of me wants to talk about gameplay and gameplay loops in relation to it. Because some people in their game design just have a lot more mileage in loops.
Sure.
That like other styles of games don't. Role-playing game might not be replayed as often as a short fighting game like Overwatch,
Yeah. So you're talking about then like replayability and how that accounts into the perception of, the value of this game.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I mean,
yeah.
Do you think that's
absolutely?
A factor? Yeah.
I do think that's a factor. If you think about EGS's goals, or honestly any platform's goals, it's that they want people to keep using that platform and they want people to keep coming back to that game, because the other component of this, they talk so much about user acquisition costs, but they actually don't ever touch on, and very few people still continue to touch on, retention. So what that means is, and what retention is that people, like they want people to continue to come back and keep opening up their game, or to keep opening up the game so that they go through the client, right? So all of these platforms really want players to be actively engaged with their proprietary client. So it makes sense. And I think you bring up a really good point, Sun, which is it makes sense for them to want a game that might have a longer life cycle, essentially, so that it keeps their retention up over time. I don't know if that's completely and entirely true, because both of those don't need to exist simultaneously, but I could see them having potentially an eye for games that, might bring in players that will continue to come back on their platform.
As someone who is making a co-op, my first thought when I saw this is, oh, this is like a great way to argue a co-op, because it will always bring in, that week, it could always bring in 2 as opposed to 1. I mean, I don't know if you've done it, but like when I download a game that has multiple players and I'm not using Steam Play or something, I'll be like, friends, get this game to play it with me. But like, I can imagine that easily being like I need to get all of my friends to download Epic for like this 1 week so that we can all play this game. And so I think that's more also like involved in the gameplay loop and replayability section.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I think that's super important. And there's another one that came up in my head, is just like, I was curious to like dig through who runs these teams. I didn't do a lot of like, I generally kind of know, but
Ominous.
I mean, like, who is getting these deals and what type of studios are actually receiving them. There are very few studios that are relatively new. I'd say that most of these studios have been around for quite some time that are on this list. I'm pretty sure that the majority of these studios have been around for at least 5 years. Most of the teams that are landing deals that are indie are roughly about 5 to 7 years. I'd be willing to put my bet on that. And then the AAAs and the publishers have also been around typically like 10 plus years. Mm-hmm. So I'd say, like, when we loop back on like who is getting these deals, I'd say that a lot of them are established studios. A lot of them have published at least 1 or 2 games. And that's I guess one thing that I'd like to touch base on, which is there's definitely some prestige that goes with getting some of these deals to be signed.
Can I also point out just one that makes me sad, which is Rhyme, because it's the lowest buyout, but it has like significant entitlements. And only got the 45K.
But at the same time, like, you just don't know unless you know.
You really, you just don't know. And Rhyme was sold in 2019? I'm just saying, like, it was starting to grow this kind of formula. Mm-hmm. And you just don't have those numbers to base yourself off of.
Yeah. And see, here's the thing, and I can share this from my own experience. Like, when we went into another buyout deal after we did Game Pass, like, I knew how many players were downloading Hyperdot, and I knew generally how far they were getting into the game and when they would come back. But that's because we're an insights team, and I recognize that a lot of other teams don't necessarily have that, especially indie teams in particular. And we took that number into our next buyout, and we shared with them, like, hey, don't look at our Steam page. Our Steam page blows because we actually didn't put that much time and effort into the strategy behind Steam. And the reason for that was because we were publishing our first console game. We were publishing our first, like, kind of big, big to us title. And I think that was really only the second or third game that we had ever even like built and published in general. But this was the first like console and PC first title. So for me, it was really important to have those numbers going into the next agreement, saying like, hey, here's our information, here's our data. We know that we had just a little over 500,000 players who actually came out of that game and had actually, like, downloaded and played the game across different platforms. And here are the numbers for each of those platforms. Mm-hmm. So this is what type of deal we're actually looking at. And they were like, oh, I get it now. And that's really smart of you. And so we were actually able to demand a higher rate based off of the number that we actually knew we had. Yeah, that I felt like was really powerful, but I don't know what everybody else has kind of going in.
I think it's really, really important, like you said, that you are like an insights team. And I actually just think that a lot of indie devs don't have access to that kind of level at the start. But looking at this list, I'm not seeing a lot of at the start indie devs either.
Yeah.
To make that comparison with.
They're all like mid to large size indie studios that have been around for 5+ years.
Yeah, they might not be big, but they've had multiple releases usually.
Yeah.
Like on this list, I'm not seeing anyone who's like, this is our first game. And here we are. I'm not seeing any perfect garbage on this list. And
you want to. You want to see
I want so much things in life.
And I want that for you, son. I want that for you too.
I would like 7-figure deal for me. You shouldn't have. You ever think about how Lego Batman was only 300,000?
Yeah, I did. I sat there and I looked at it and I was like, wow, Batman.
Yeah, but they still got
Batman.
It was only like they still got a great UA cost for $6.38. So Lego Batman knew what was up when they made that deal.
And see, here's the thing. I swear no one actually knew when they went in. I thought that maybe Devolver would know, but then I was wrong. So I have a feeling that everyone's just kind of like, this feels right for my game. If we're going to talk about deals, I feel like the Subnautica team should have asked for like 2.5 to 3 million. Like based off of the percentage of new users that they brought onto that platform, I was like, oh my God.
Were they the first one?
Yeah, like when was the launch?
Yeah, it launched in December 2018. So that's
it was the first.
The first.
Yeah. That's why it has such a high
that's why it has a high number for acquisition.
Good for it. That's a great time to get in on that deal. Number one.
Nice.
Then let's just for the sake of being devil's advocate, I want to look for the second highest acquisition, which is 10%, and it belongs to Batman Arkham.
1.5 mil, and then they were like, we can give you some Lego Batman on the side.
Honestly, if you look at the dates of that deal, it's the same day.
So
oh my God,
they probably were connected. They probably like paid this team that 1.5. Well, it's all Warner Brothers, so who knows?
Yeah,
maybe it's some Warner Brothers hounds. But they might have thrown it in as a bonus, like, we'll also give you this for an extra
300K.
Yeah. To sweeten the pot.
Interesting.
I'm sad that we're not getting any 2020 on here because indie is hitting, I don't want to say is hitting a boom. Indie's always been around, but there's been this great kind of upturn to indie that is led by a lot of platforms too, that are helping push this wave. And so are the 2020 deals different? Are we starting to see higher numbers for indies or AA? With the level of UA cost that we like what was Hades' stats? I want to know.
Okay, moving on from this, like this spreadsheet, this data set. How do y'all feel like this actually impacts studios and also publishers and that relationship together? Like, I'm very curious what the outcome is going to be, because this also released at roughly around the same time that like Raw Fury had also released their like agreements and such too.
It was like bam, 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 game industry lore. So my hot take is that it is both wonderful and dangerous. And the reason why I want to bring up it being dangerous is that it's just hasn't been done wide scale yet. I'm going to relate this to the thing that I know best, which is crowdfunding. Crowdfunding gives you
rolling it back.
Yeah, well, crowdfunding makes your stats available to the public ASAP. And when I was crowdfunding, I thought, wow, we did great on Kickstarter. Getting picked up by a publisher for our first game should be no biggie. When in fact, the stats from that crowdfunding would be argued like either one, yes, the way I was hoping for, or two, that we've already hit our audience. So when I look at this, all I can think about is this is great because it gives you a solid leg to stand on when you are making a deal that is in relation to, like you said, understanding your community, knowing how many people download your game, using that information to make those deals. But to counter, if you have poor traction on this, for example, or if you have a high UA costs that just doesn't, sit well with a publisher or a platform, for example, then this is the argument not to fund you or not to make a deal with you. So I'm always like, double-edged sword. It's really, really great, and I'm really happy it happened. But navigating it is, especially those on this list, navigating it is going to be something that quite requires finesse in some way.
Yeah. There's definitely kind of this vibe in terms of like shift of what I've seen, at least, of, well, why would we work with a publisher if we can get some of these platform deals? Because, right, like if you look at some of these deals, a lot of publishers do typically tend to, at least a good chunk of them tend to sign deals that are definitely sub $1 million. So if you can land, say, like a platform deal of some sorts, I can imagine, especially if it's with EGS in particular, it comes afterwards, right? Like it is an uptick in the long tail. Yeah, there isn't anything that comes for like pre-launch, which I think is a whole nother story and a whole nother episode. But I believe that, from what I've seen, I recognize that there's a lot more conversation around like, okay, well, if we can land a platform deal, then why work with a publisher? What is the value here? Are they actually taking a percentage of these types of buyouts that they're shaving off at the beginning right away?
They have
like that's a whole conversation.
But if their name is on the if their name is on the developer column, then I'm going to assume they're taking their fee for negotiating that deal. I mean, one of the things that I know I wanted to talk about was, what does it mean when a publisher pitches your game to platforms? And like, how does that result in these deals? What does it mean for a developer to have that kind of like representation towards these deals? And how does that money get divvied up? Check out later in one of our following episodes. We're definitely going to be diving into that because I think it's a very cool and interesting topic.
So thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. I hope you had a good time.
Usually on this show, we actually discuss deals that are happening, that are currently happening. And if you have a deal, all anonymous, please feel free to fill out the Google form below and send it our way. We'd love to discuss it and kind of dive deep into your own numbers. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed the show and continue the conversation with us, literally us specifically, and our great community on our discord.gg/heyglitch. Also on twitter.com/heyglitch. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Or we won't.
Yes, we will.
Don't abandon us. I want your deals.
Our viewers are going to come back.
Okay.